With Kiev, it just seems at this point we haven't seen any signs that they are really willing to surrender, to admit defeat. They're not even close to that. And they seem to be of the mind that they would rather suffer a total defeat than to actually consent to any kind of negotiated settlement. That seems to be their psychology.
Is the U.S. still enabling Ukraine? And if so, to what extent?
Well, oh yes, it most definitely is. Remember, there was that cutoff in military supplies, which was real, but it only lasted a few days. So in the end, it made no difference whatsoever. It was just, certain amount of equipment was held in the warehouses in Poland, for a few days, and then they were put on the trains, and the flow continues. Nothing's really changed as far as that goes. And then the talk about the intelligence cutoff, it's just not even clear if there really was an intelligence cutoff, or it certainly wasn't complete. So yeah, the U.S. is still backing them to the hilt. I don't see any sign. There's talk, and we've said the talk is important, and the talk can indicate changes down the road, but at present, there are no changes.
Well, why is that? I mean, if you say that the Kiev regime is the main obstacle right now because they will not negotiate and they're being backed by the EU saying, don't negotiate, keep on fighting. I don't know what their goal is to keep fighting for, but the U.S. says they want to get a negotiated peace settlement, but at the same time, they're still enabling Ukraine. Yeah. So do they really want a negotiated peace settlement, or is this are they just playing games with us? I don't trust anybody anymore,
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I don't really know either. I don't know what's going on in the head of Trump or in his administration in general. Again, we have heard encouraging statements, and there have been, maybe you don't want to call them substantive. We're talking about like votes in the UN and withdrawal from certain very anti-Russian organizations. I think those are all meaningful. I mean, it's more than just, an off-the-cuff remark. There have been some, Trump has backed up some of his comments with some, you can say, action, not on the front, not, maybe where it really counts, but in the UN, with regard to the NGOs, the kind of the larger, you could say, support apparatus, the propaganda machine, and so on and so forth. Those things do count for something, and he has made some. He has changed direction there. We have to admit it, but nothing has really changed on the ground. There was that temporary suspension, and they really didn't get anything for it. It was this agreement to a temporary ceasefire that I think Kiev probably never expected the Russians to reject. And if the Russians accepted, the Kiev probably would not have even abided by it. So I don't know why they resumed the flow of weapons. I think that was a big mistake. So it really is hard to say. We've talked quite a bit about this. Again, there are encouraging signs, but you look at it substantively, very little has happened. Even on the diplomatic front, even in the embassy still haven't been restaffed.
It's a little worrying. Yeah, so there was this, after the Trump-Putin call, there was that talk of this 30-day partial ceasefire where they would cease attacks on each other's energy infrastructure. Right. But shortly thereafter, it seemed like Putin wanted to make good on that immediately. You said that they even shot their own drones out of the sky that were on their way to hit some energy infrastructure in Ukraine. And then a day later, Ukraine pulls off this huge attack on the Suja pipeline. Can you tell us a little bit about that attack?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was an attack just, I think, a few hours after the phone call, or, within 24 hours. That wasn't on Suja. I think that was I believe the oil pipeline, maybe a pumping station in Krasnodar, that was connected to the Caspian Petroleum Consortium. We mentioned that. Now, that was significant. It happened after the Trump-Putin phone call and the announcement that Putin had agreed to this energy infrastructure ceasefire. But Ukraine went ahead with this attack. But people pointed out and say, well, maybe it doesn't mean anything because Ukraine hasn't agreed to it yet. But then Trump and Putin, or not Trump and Putin, but rather Trump and Zelensky had a phone conversation. And at the end of that, it was reported that Zelensky had agreed to the ceasefire. Yet following that, there was the attack on the Suja metering station that you just mentioned. And that just seems like just a blatant effort to, it's the opposite of, a gesture of goodwill. It was obviously a very malicious gesture, an effort to subvert the ceasefire. And they did it immediately, hours after it was stated that they were going to abide by it. So, yeah, I don't think there's much reason to be hopeful about, the Kiev regime, just as I was saying. I think it's actually a mistake for the Americans. I think maybe the Russians understand this a lot better because they've been burned by the Ukrainians many times in the past, and they just don't trust them anymore. But Trump seems to think that Ukraine and Russia can somehow achieve some sort of settlement. But it seems to me again that Kiev's making it clear that no, that's just not possible. They're not interested in peace talks. They would rather, I think they'll be lashing out to the end. These kind of attacks that we see, these drone attacks, they have almost no military significance. You can argue that like attacks on energy infrastructure, clearly, potentially could have military significance if they were, very extensive. Like the attacks that Russia's launched against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. It's been devastating. They've lost something like 80% of their electrical capacity. But you don't see anything like that. Again, these are more for show. It's more about, it's about the information war more than the real war. Because they're done by drones. Drones are cheap. You can produce a lot of them. You can send, 100 in one direction, and even if the Russians, shoot down 99 of them, one might get through and hit an oil refining plant and cause a big fire, and there you have your headline. But in the end, the damage that it does to these facilities is relatively superficial. It hasn't had an effect on Russia's economy, and certainly not on, and not even on its really oil production and refining capacity. There's just no sign of it. Oil or gasoline prices are not going up in Russia. Nothing of the sort. They continue to export, I think, increasing amounts around the globe. It's really all for show, these attacks. But Kiev, it's like, it's the only place where they feel like they can win, or maybe, it's in the information warfare arena. We can send some drones out there and we can get some headlines. And, I see the headlines, it's like amazing, devastating attack, but they're clearly not devastating attacks. And I think they want to continue to do these, even as they clearly lose the real war.
It's so clear that the real war is being lost. Why is there so much resistance to peace? Why? I can understand somebody like Zelensky that's in this position where basically, if he doesn't carry this through, the ultranationalists might just kill him, and he's gone this far. Mm-hmm. He's sacrificed so much Ukrainian blood and land, and he feels like he has to have something to show for it. But why is there still so much resistance amongst the Europeans to go for peace? Because, like you say, they don't really have anything to back it up. They're not willing to go in militarily. And even if they do, they're going to get chewed up and spat out. They don't have any industrial capacity. This attack, from what I understand, on the Suja metering pipeline was feeding into Europe, right? So this is attack more on Europe's energy infrastructure more so than it was on Russia. So everything just seems to be self-inflicted. Wounds and no real plan or direction, but just keep going until the whole thing collapses. And it seems clear that that's what's happening. If they don't get a negotiated peace settlement, the whole thing will just collapse on their heads. And Maybe they're just maybe they are delusional. I don't know. That doesn't seem like a satisfying answer, though. I feel like
Yeah.
there's got to be some. What's the plan? What are they working towards?
I don't think they have a plan, to be honest, or their plan is really out there in fantasy land. It's not based on any reality. I would say we've looked at it from different angles. One thing I just will emphasize today is that when you commit to a war, like Zelensky and his government committed to this war, it becomes very difficult to admit defeat because the thing, especially in a way, it's like the more that you suffer, the greater the defeat, the more difficult it becomes to admit it. Because if you finally say, okay, yeah, we made a mistake, we lost this war, you're telling, the parents of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers that, okay, yeah, that was my mistake, my bad, that's, and it's something I think it's almost impossible for a political leader to admit that kind of error. So they double down and they keep on saying, okay, yeah, maybe things aren't going so well right now, but there's this wonder weapon that's in the pipeline, or we've got this plan. We're gonna strike them. We're gonna reverse the outcome on the battlefield, and we'll be marching towards Moscow, or Moscow is actually on the verge of collapse. It's just like the sanctions will finally bite, and the Russian economy will collapse. It's all nonsense, and there's no reason to believe it. They've been saying it, for these things for 3 years, but they have to keep on saying them because, again, the alternative is, oops, a million dead people. Sorry about that. And I think it's maybe emotionally and on virtually every level, it's impossible for a leader to admit to something like that. And then it's kind of similar, you can say, within Europe. Obviously the costs aren't nearly as great for these countries. They've lost some young men, mercenaries and so-called mercenaries, people that have been sent over there. But we're talking about at the most hundreds rather than a million or whatever it is in Ukraine. But there has been economic sacrifice. There has been a lot of politicians have, really staked their careers on this, and I think it's part of the same thing. It doesn't explain it entirely. It should be easier for the Europeans to pull out of this because, they've made an emotional commitment, but it's just nothing like what the Ukrainian government has got itself into. So yeah, I think you have to look at this. I think you really do have to talk about some sort of, about delusion, this obsession with moral purity in the sense of them being superior in every way. They really bought into the neocon vision, and now they're, even when their master is seems to be turning away from it. They have the zeal of the convert, and again, part of that vision is that no, we are number one. We are the most powerful alliance in the world. So it's just not possible. We really cannot countenance the possibility of a Russian victory. That cannot happen. And so if things are not going well on the battlefield, it must not because, we misjudged our own abilities and we, underestimated the Russians, but rather we just haven't done enough. We just need to double down. And, that's the way they're talking. I mean, it's not like I'm just making this up. That's the way they talk. And they really have said things. I think I quoted, it was the Polish prime minister recently that has said, yeah, we are simply more powerful. It's just an article of faith with them. They're wedded to this ideological vision, and unfortunately, this ideological vision is just entirely divorced from reality, and they're having trouble getting out of it. Or you can explain it a different way. They can help to build this narrative, and they become prisoners of their own narrative. There are a lot of ways to kind of express it, but I would just emphasize that in the case of the Europeans, they just seem to be extraordinarily, delusional.
Are they delusional enough to send troops? Because it keeps on coming up. They keep on
Yeah,
talking about sending people into Ukraine. And I'm just wondering, are they one day going to do it?
yeah. Well, it could happen. I, they just don't have armies that can really present, a serious threat to Russia or even offer much resistance. I know that, like, on paper, the British have something like 60,000 combat capable troops, but I think that's an overestimate. When you look at the actual, brigades and divisions, they're just they don't they don't have the equipment. So much of that equipment has been sent overseas, or not overseas, but rather to Ukraine. What is it? The British Navy has more admirals than it has ships. It has more generals than it has operable tanks. These are the kind of France is a little bit better off, but really not much. So anyway, yeah, they don't have it. They can send a token force that can get obliterated. What is that? And they just might. Again, it just seems like, I guess you have to say this for them. They seem to be aware that they are aware to some extent of their weakness on some level, because they have asked again and again for a security guarantee from the U.S. They say, U.S., please, yeah, serve as our backstop. We'll go in there, but you'll be our backstop. So in other words, they're admitting that they can't do anything, that they can just be tripwire forces. And the hope against hope that, they'll draw the Americans in if they do suffer an attack by the Russians. So there is a bit of realism. I'm sure their defense departments the defense departments in Europe are telling their respective governments, hey, we just don't have many people. I'm sorry, we really can't do this.
Do you think the delusional behavior we're seeing from France and Britain has something to do with their martial history? I mean, if you go back in the past, England was that the British Empire was where the sun never set, right? They ruled the world at one point in time. And France had the Napoleonic era where, they ruled Europe. Is there some of that you think that is sort of deep set in people like Starmer and Macron? And that's one of the reasons that they just can't accept the fact that we're not as great as, our history tells us we are?
Yeah, I think there's no question about it. It's just that they, especially the Brits have taken the fall of their empire badly. And what they've done to really compensate for that is to ally themselves closely with the U.S. And they just, through their association with the U.S., they can, as they say, punch above their weight. They can pretend to be more powerful than they actually are. So, when the U.S. went to Iraq, the Brits sent in people in Iraq, same thing in Afghanistan and so forth. So they can, through their association with the U.S., and present themselves as still a major player in the world, one of the great powers. But now we see, now that the U.S. seems to be intent on pulling out, it's just like the British lapdog is just a lapdog. That's, but they're not taking it very well. Yeah, there's some sort of, we're getting a lot of Churchillian rhetoric from Starmer. He's pretending that, okay, now is the time for Britain to perform its historic role, and yet we're hearing the same kind of thing, echoes of Napoleon in France. I think that there's a lot to be said for that. But it's so far from the reality, though, that in the end, it's just going to be comical. It may end up, well, it's comedy now. It may end up a tragedy. I don't know.